Before we get started tonight, I had a prayer request. Josh Queen asked us if we could say a prayer for him. Just kind of had a rough day, had some things happen at the mall that really brought in some fear for him. And so we're going to say a quick prayer for Josh Queen. And then at the end of the night, Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you when we're all done. If you would just give you a heads up, if you would pray for the blessing of the day and anything else maybe you know of that we need to add to that, I'll have you come and lead us in a closing prayer. But if you would join me in a brief word of prayer, and then we'll get started. Father, we are so grateful to be able to come before your throne. Lord, it is such a privilege to know that you are protecting us, that you are All right, come on up, Chad. So if this is, I think most of us here at this point have been part of these Q&As before. We've been fielding some questions throughout the day, and as I expected, I got blasted with probably about 6 or 8 here in the last about 7 minutes. Good. So it's great. It's fantastic. It means that Chad has no clue what's coming at him.
This is the hot seat then.
Yeah, it's very much the hot seat. No, it's this is going to be good. So Chad, I want to begin. You've mentioned your kids, your family, and some of that kind of stuff. But before we get into questions from folks, I'd like for you to give us a little bit more about you. Help us get to know you on a little bit more personal level. We've enjoyed hearing your knowledge about this, but tell us a little bit about. Where did you grow up? What was it? What was your church history growing up? How did you come to faith in Jesus and begin that Christian walk?
So I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama, same as this guy right here. So you've got 2 Alabama boys up on the stage tonight in Colorado, which is interesting. But I grew up in Huntsville. Huntsville has got a lot of great churches, and I grew up at the Maysville Church, which is on the outskirts of Huntsville. And went there pretty much my entire adult life. We went to Lincoln Church of Christ a little bit before that in central Huntsville. But I think a lot about the story of Eunice, because I had a lot of good women in my family that were very good mentors. My grandmother and my mother in particular, who were very good mentors. They were the ones that were taking us to worship. And so I had a very good foundation of that. My dad did not become a Christian until very late in his life, less than 10 years ago. And my grandfather actually never became a Christian, and so that was a big influence in my early days. But I grew up there, went to high school there, went straight into the Marine Corps. I literally graduated, and the next week I was in boot camp, so I didn't even have a summer vacation that summer. But I went into the Marine Corps in the summer of 2000. And graduated in September of 2000. And we'll all know what happened in September 2001. It changed everything about how we did anything in the military. And suddenly our mission was not peacekeeping, it was very active, and we went in all sorts of different places. For most of my career, I was in an aircraft squadron in North Carolina, and we would go 2 weeks to Saudi Arabia and all sorts of different places in the Middle East, and I served in Afghanistan and then Iraq later in 2003. Got to go to Western Africa on a peacekeeping mission. Got to be stationed out in California and did some testing for a new kind of aircraft that we were putting out. If you have worked on the KC-130J aircraft, I wrote the documentation or at least part of the documentation for the power plants on that aircraft, which are the engines that run it. And so that's kind of my history up to then. I decided very quickly that I did not want to be in the Marine Corps my entire life. I wanted to go to college, and I wanted to have a little bit of fun. And I went to Freed-Hardeman University, met my wife there, majored in youth ministry and graphic design, actually. So I double majored in design and in ministry, and met my wife. We married in 2008. We first moved out to Virginia, and it was wonderful being out there. We were 40 minutes south of D.C. We could get up. We had no kids, you know. We could get up and go to D.C. I was joking with Corey before. We would wake up on Saturday morning and just decide to go to D.C. And we didn't have any kids. We didn't have anything to plan. Now we have to plan like 2 or 3 days in advance to go to Target. So it's like, it's just amazing what changes when you have those children. And so we had our first child in 2011. And a year and a half, 2 years later, we found out that he was going to be on the autism spectrum. He was diagnosed with that. And that was really difficult because it was one of the first kind of situations, even in the Marines, literally, you know, working on the things that I was getting shot at in an airplane. It didn't even cross my mind when I was young then, but this was the first time in my life where I really had to give something wholly to God all the way, because my wife and I could not handle this. And I prayed to God after that. I said, I don't know what I'm going to do with this. And luckily, God has been with us. He led us to Graymere in 2015. So many people have responded to Jacob and been, Jacob is my eldest son, and they've responded to him. The special needs ministry at Graymere was essentially created for him. So it was just a wonderful, wonderful blessing to be going there. My 2 other sons were born after that, of course, David and Micah, and they are, you know, neurotypical. If you meet both of them, you'll know exactly why. And it's just been an incredible blessing ever since then. I'm enjoying the journey with my family, and I'm enjoying my work at Graymere as education minister. If you wonder what that is, at Graymere, I'm also the everything else minister. I not just have education, I'm in charge of some of the things that we do in technology. I'm in charge of some design stuff, some of the other initiatives that we have, and it's really nice. It was really nice in 2020. I was telling Corey this I was telling Mike this actually in the car today, that it was an immense blessing to me. It was a ton of work, but it was an immense blessing to me to be in the position that I was in to help our congregation when COVID happened in March of 2020. Because I went from a regular 40-hour work week to doing probably 60, 70, 80 hours a week on video and nothing else. But I was able to serve, and I was able to be there when they needed me, and it was really great. So that's kind of the history up to this point.
And we have an everything else minister. He's in the balcony right now. His name is Brian Ketchum. So, you know, give props to him for being that same kind of guy. I'm a little.
And you asked how I came to faith. I'm sorry, I completely skipped over that.
So, yeah. How did you?
So we used to have a thing called we called it Freed Camp. We apparently didn't know that there was any other camp, but we went to Freed-Hardeman, spent the week at Freed-Hardeman because our minister at the time, Tim Orbison, was a graduate of Freed-Hardeman, and so we actually went to Freed-Hardeman, not Mid-South, but we went to Freed-Hardeman and spent a week at camp. And that week, Lonnie Jones actually became our youth minister. And so I got to grow up with Lonnie Jones as my youth minister, which was crazy to think about now. And we had some studies and talked together about some things. And at 14, I decided that I was going to give my life to Christ, and I did. And I was the last of my group of little friends to do that. I felt like I was kind of late to the party. But I've also since realized that God's timing is perfect. And he knew exactly when I needed to make that decision. And it was, I remember the date, June 9th, 1996. And that seems like an age ago, but I can remember it as plain as day, the most important day of my life. And so that's the story there.
That's great. So in your ministry, you've been in ministry for a lot of years now. I mean, just at Graymere for 7. And so, I mean, you're well over the 10-year mark with this. How did you begin latching on to this particular topic of the digital parenting? Was it just a natural outgrowth because, as you've said several times, you're just a nerd?
I am.
And is that part of it? Was there a particular need that surfaced that you kind of went, okay, I've got to put some material together, and it just kind of grew from there? How did you get into this?
So again, with that, God's timing is absolutely perfect, and God's blessings are absolutely perfect, because the church that I now work for, the youth minister there at the time, Chris Webb, called me in 2013. He says, hey man, I got this thing I want to do for my parents. We're doing these special Wednesday nights. I want you to come for 4 Wednesday nights in a row. And at this point, I lived about 20 minutes away. I lived right across the highway, so it wasn't a big deal for me to go and travel over there. He said, I want to do 4 weeks on internet safety. And that's what we called it initially, was the internet safety course or whatever it was. And I thought I was going to get over there, and there were going to be 10 parents just kind of sitting there like, okay, tell us something we don't know. The first Wednesday night I got over there was 150 parents, all packed into this one room. I went over my first lesson and could not believe the response. I did it for 3 weeks after that, and I really didn't even think about it after that, Corey. It was just kind of well, that was cool. That was really neat. I wrote all this stuff, and I've spent all this time making these lessons, and I said, well, maybe I'll get to use these some other place. From there, though, it was very slow to start, but it started. I didn't do any kind of promotion for it, didn't really talk it up, but I would go to youth minister meetings, and I would go to these little conferences and things, and people would say, yeah, we need something like that at our church. Why don't you come? And it just kind of snowballed from there. In 2019, I did 17 of them. And then, of course, COVID hit, and I thought, well, that'll kill it. I won't be able to do this. Everybody will forget about it, and it'll be fine. And that has not happened at all. I did my first one after COVID in January of 21, and I've done about probably 15 since. And the only problem that I've had with this workshop was that there's only one of me. I need to train other people to do this workshop in other areas of the country. And it's been really, really wonderful, and just a huge blessing to me.
Excellent. Well, we're glad that you're out here doing this with us and giving us some of these insights. To jump into some questions and some other discussions, I want to go back for at least a couple of minutes here. Your very first lesson this morning, you talked about God's relationship to our technology, and one of the big points that you made within it is God is not surprised. There's nothing we can come up with, technologically speaking, that God says, oh, didn't see that coming. It occurred to me, and I wanted to see if you just want to maybe expound upon it just a bit. It seems to me that should bring about a great deal of confidence in us, to realize that God is not surprised by anything that we have going on. And I'm curious if you feel the same way, and if so, how would you describe what that confidence should look like?
Absolutely. I think it absolutely should make us more confident. And I think, for me, Corey, I think it gives me a lot of comfort, just knowing that God has seen all of what humanity is going to do. We cannot, with our finite little human brains, we cannot fathom what that means. We cannot fathom that God is outside of time, and that he knows all, and he's omnipotent, and he is all, and he's through us all. I don't know what that means, but that gives me such comfort and such confidence that there is nothing that is going to destroy him, first of all, but obviously his church here on earth, the church that his son built. And I hear all the time, Corey. I hear from people who are negative, down and out about the church, about, the church is dying, the church is not doing very well. And I just want to tell them, where have you been to see that? Because the places that I've been, I find extreme confidence in how the church is growing and how the next generation is going to use the technology that we have to influence people for Christ in ways we could never imagine. And so I think about those things give me a lot of confidence and again, give me a lot of comfort on that.
Yeah, and you talk about the idea of next generation, or even those of us within the current generations using this technology in ways that we can't even imagine right now. It's changing so rapidly. It occurred to me in the course of your lessons today that so much of what we're describing is not about technology being evil in and of itself. We tend to get frustrated at what we see in the technological realm, and maybe our language begins to shift in a way that says, well, no, that Facebook's of the devil or whatever. And it's really not that the technology is evil inherently. It's how we use it. One example of this, and then I'll have a question coming off of it. The idea that God is not surprised by our technology, but the fact that God has used technology, it is a tool in His hands. I'm curious to maybe get your thought on how you said, he used the technology of that day to bring salvation. The smith who made the nail, who forged the nails, the spikes, the woodworker who would have done whatever he needed to do to make that cross, and all those different things going on. What do you think are some examples that you see God able to use technology today to bring salvation in a way that is just cool or gives you even more excitement about what could be coming down the road?
Well, I'll give you a really good example. COVID was something that was terrible. Still dealing with it a little bit. Still had the things but when we were all forced to go into lockdown, what were churches forced to do? Churches were forced to adapt. They were pushed forward. A lot of our churches, we've got a lot of small towns in Tennessee that never would have thought about live streaming or online ministry or reaching people in that way, other than if they had not been pushed into that. And so in a positive way, I think that somehow COVID has pushed that forward by about 5 or 10 years, accelerated it by 5 or 10 years almost. And so I think that is one of those unbelievably wonderful things that we can see coming from this use of technology, is being able to minister to anybody, anywhere. And there's always something to be said for the assembly. There's always something to be said for, if we can be at worship and worship with the saints, then that's what we need to do. But being able to be flexible with our shut-ins and be able to talk to people in other countries. We had, during COVID, we were able to Skype in some of our missionaries from India and from Peru, and they taught a Bible lesson for us on some of those Sundays, and it was just amazing to see. We called it our ministry switcheroo. We actually preached their sermons, they preached to our sermons, and it was stuff like that could not have been done 20 years ago. And maybe not even 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And so some of the advancements, some of these things that we're seeing nowadays is some unbelievable uses for technology. And we can really use it to really further the kingdom, I think, and expand it.
So just to give you all a little bit of an idea of how the technology has been helpful and for Bear Valley is going to be helpful down the road. We've been live streaming since COVID, and we've had multiple people who have come through our doors because they found us online first. They had no other reason to come through our door that they knew of, but the Google search for churches in Denver and whatnot brought that up, and we've had at least a couple of baptisms that have come out of that. Brian is working very hard right now. We're actually renovating one of the rooms downstairs into a production studio. That what we hope to have happening within the next couple of years. Is that fair, Brian? Well, yeah, he says thumbs up. In the next couple of years is seeing more evangelistic focused videos and podcasts and things along those lines that you're going to get an opportunity to share with other people, and maybe those of you that are interested, maybe even take part in, and all those kinds of things. So technology definitely has its great uses and its great abilities. Depends upon how you choose to use it. Okay, so switch gears here a little bit. A lot of the questions that have come in to us have to do on one level with the very practical that you just got through with in the 4 o'clock session. What are some of the different apps? What are some of the different services that are available? We may spend a few minutes right there on some of those questions, but then we also have a few questions that have come in regarding how to set those boundaries for kids, how to help enforce them in the proper way. But even one of our teens messaging, how can teens build trust with parents to gain more access and all that kind of stuff. So to kind of give you an idea of where we're headed. From the perspective of just technology services, somebody asked me, said, if Bark stinks so badly, which one would you recommend using? What service would you recommend using to help filter out some of that content?
Honestly, screen time, if you have an iPhone, Family Link if you have an Android, I think I hit on that pretty good in the last session. That's really some really good tools to use initially. If you need further internet filters, I would suggest using something through your internet service provider or buying one of those Eero devices that you can hook up to your home network and filter and have another kind of wall of protection that way. But you might be surprised. I was talking to a lady and gentleman over here you might be really surprised if you just go and dig into the built-in whatever's on your phone screen time settings and to know how much stuff that covers. And it's a really good place to start. I really think some of these apps like Bark are really, they're going to get there. They're just not there yet. They're not to the point where I can say this is sign up for account, plug and play, and you're off to the races. Because for parents, for non-tech parents, you need to make sure that you can have something that's effective, that's easy to use. And right now, that's unfortunately not a lot of things. Back in the day, there was Net Nanny and there was Covenant Eyes and things like that. Those things weren't easy to use back then either, or easy to set up. But once you did do it, they were very effective in that way. But right now, I would say what is built in and what you can do with Google Play Family Link on Android devices, I'd really try to go that avenue.
You mentioned Covenant Eyes. I actually had somebody ask specifically about that one. Covenant Eyes is an organization that has really focused in a lot on the pornography epidemic in our world, and so it's an accountability system.
That's exactly what it is.
It's what it is, and so what can happen with Covenant Eyes is you can download an actual internet browser. It is a service you pay for, but you download a service, the browser, and then you set these filters and you have the accountability partners so that if it's on my device, then let's say when I go search things, then my wife is the accountability partner, so she gets an email if there's some kind of search that triggers a red flag, right? And you would do it, if your kids do that, then you get the email. Have you had any experience with, I'll ask for that one in particular, but there may be others similar to it that...
I've known people to use it with great success.
Okay.
I know people that currently use it, but you're right, it is focused on pornography, and so not so much on necessarily parental controls. I could see how it could be used for a type of parental controls, but again, Covenant Eyes is doing a lot. They used to be a lot more far-reaching, and they kind of focused in when the mobile devices came out, and iPhones and Android phones and things like that, they really kind of zero-focused on protecting in pornography and the special browser and things like that. And so, yeah, highly recommended if that's something that you need to use for sure. And I will tell you, we don't talk about that enough. We do not talk about how big of a problem, and that's a whole other thing that we could talk about, but we don't talk about how big of a problem pornography is. It is a cancer that affects a lot more people than you might think. And I feel like we kind of avoid that as churches sometimes because it's awkward to talk about. It may be inconvenient for us to talk about, but it is one of the most prevalent things on a device that is absolutely tempting for not just young men, not just younger men, but young girls are being more attracted to that kind of thing, being tempted by that kind of stuff. And that is something that we absolutely need to understand and talk to our kids about for sure.
So similar or springboard off, you were talking a lot about screen time and Family Link and whatnot. A couple of questions on those that came in is, just to clarify, is Screen Time, Family Link, is this helpful for filtering content?
Yes.
Okay, it's not just about controlling the amount of time that your kids
Yes.
are on it. It does actually help you filter the content that comes to their device.
Yes. So I can go into my screen time settings right now for my, I had it on my, but if you go to family sharing on your device, if you have set up family sharing for that, I can sit here and look right now and see my 10-year-old's access and what we have limited him on. And so what we've got here is I can go to screen time and see exactly what I've gotten set up here for him. And we've been able to content restrict a lot of things. He cannot look at the Safari browser. He cannot look at the App Store. He doesn't even have those icons on his iPad to be able to look at those things. He has to ask for approval for also, he doesn't even get the approval thing yet because he's not old enough yet. And he has to basically go through us so that we can update apps or load apps on his phone. But it's all sorts of different content filtering, all sorts of different things that are included in that. And again, like I was just telling a couple people over here, that it's one of those things where there's 4 or 5, 6 different categories. You just dive into those, and there's a whole bunch of different switches you can switch off and on. And you find out exactly what you need to do to protect your child, for sure.
From the Android side of things, somebody's asking, can you actually remove YouTube from an Android phone? Or
Yes.
is it so built in that it's just part and parcel?
It's built in because Google owns YouTube, of course, but it is built in to where if you do, you can remove the app. To my knowledge, on an Android, I haven't touched a newer Android phone in a while, but you can actually delete the app off of there, and when you put those parental controls on, they cannot re-download that. And so, but there are still the hooks in the system to where anytime it wants to load a video or anything like that, it's going to say, open this on YouTube. And if you hit that, it's just going to go nowhere if they don't have that app on there. And so again, yes, you can delete that off of there.
Okay. Someone asked this question, what resources are there, since we're mentioning YouTube and things along those lines, what resources are available to review what TV shows and movies are appropriate for kids?
Okay, so there is one called Common Sense Media.
Okay.
And it's very good. I'm going to go to, I've got a lot of this information on my website, and not to promote my website, but that's where I like to show people, under the resources tab. And so there's the Common Sense Media, which is
Hang on
great.
one moment. Jace, why don't we go ahead and, if you would, open up a browser there to what, digital parenting?
Yeah, if you just go to digitalparentingworkshop.com.
Digitalparentingworkshop.com. Go ahead and open it up and show resources, and let's let people see this right quick.
So there's just a couple of links here on this one right here, and I'm adding more every single week. Like I said, this website's only been up for about a month. But there's Common Sense Media. That's an excellent place for you to go and check out movie reviews. They're pretty in-depth about some of the things that they say about movies, and they even say, there was a little bit LGBTQ content here, and there was a person used this curse word here, and this is why this got this rating, and things like that. And they'll talk about even awkward scenes about, we looked at the first Sonic the Hedgehog movie for this because we wanted to allow our 8-year-old to see it. And there was a reference where they were in a bar, and there was some drinking going on, and so it was kind of that detailed. And so these people really do watch this and do these reviews. Go up to the resources tab if you would. Yeah, and if you scroll down, I've got a couple of downloads there, but if you scroll down to those links, and I'm adding new ones, every week or whatever, there's the Family Online Safety Institute. They're really great. And the Digital Citizen Academy, I found that they've got a lot of good content as well. That's more geared to helping your child become this responsible digital citizen. I've used a lot of their materials and some stuff. I've got a couple of just random links to random websites. You got an ultimate guide to TikTok, 10 resources to talk to your kids about porn. That's a really good article. And then there's one, there's a youth toolkit for the Center for Humane Technology. This is an initiative that some of these people have put out. They're actually former employees of YouTube and Google and Facebook and I believe Apple that have formed this kind of Center for Humane Technology. And they really try to preach this responsible use, also moderated use of technology these days. And it's actually really neat to look at. And so, yeah, just follow some of those links. And that's just a few of the resources that I like to look at. And I've taken some stuff from those. I've also got a number of books. I didn't bring usually I bring a stack of books with me. If you're a reader, there is some fantastic reading out there that you can do on this subject. Wired Child by Richard Freed is really great. There's one called, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head what these were called. Self-Reliant Parenting is another one that it's a really good. It's not necessarily on digital parenting. In fact, it has nothing to do with technology, actually, because it was written back in the 90s. But it says it's a guide to helping your child become a self-reliant individual. And it's just a really good overall parenting book as well. And so, again, I'm going to list some of those books. I'm going to add some of those resources and downloads and links to those different things as well on my website soon.
Good. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to... Oh, one more on resources side, and then we'll shift gears here for a few minutes. One question came in. What about with churches? What sort of filters and protections do you recommend for, say, church Wi-Fi?
So for church Wi-Fi, that gets into a lot, because you're going to have to go to the kind of enterprise business level of kind of protection. And what I absolutely endorse is OpenDNS for that. I talked about it a little bit in our 4 o'clock session, but if you go to opendns.com, and they will actually guide you into installing that on routers at the church building, at your different places. If you own a business and you want a filter that you don't have to think about, you can actually, it's not something that you install, but you change a setting and it allows you to have that filtering system. It's completely free. If you're a parent or if you're a church and you want to pay them for like $20 or $25 a year, you can get a weekly or monthly report sent and see what websites were visited on your network, what sites were blocked, all sorts of things. Cisco, and they have this thing called Umbrella that's actually really good as well, and it's kind of enterprise class kind of stuff. And so again, that would work for any business, and there's a fee for that every month. But really, OpenDNS is just really wonderful. Again, no filter's perfect. They're going to get it wrong sometimes too. They're going to block something that shouldn't be blocked, and they're going to allow something that shouldn't be allowed sometimes. It just happens. But overall, it's a very, very good filter.
So we've got about 15 or so more minutes, and I'd like for us to spend these last few minutes talking about some of the different conversations, how to be able to have those.
The easy stuff, right?
The easy stuff, yeah. I wanted you to deal with all the hard stuff first, and so now we'll just do the easy ones that nobody ever has any struggles with. What is a good way to talk to our kids about better control of their devices? How do you help instill in them the need for it and to understand where those boundaries or the control needs to be?
You know, part of it is coming from the kid's perspective too. We need to understand kids do not have the experience and willpower to keep themselves in check. We, at very young ages, we have to help them do that. We have to teach them to do that. And again, that just comes down to parenting. That's not even really digital parenting. That's just regular parenting. But really, I really say everything in moderation with these kinds of things. Because what you've got is you've got kids that were born with iPads in their hands, basically. When we talk about, and I hear people say, well, you know what, these kids they're on their devices nonstop, and they're using these iPads and things, they're using them as babysitters. And I'm like, yeah. And you know what? My mom put me in front of the television to watch Ninja Turtles every afternoon so she could cook dinner and not be bothered and everything like that. So we've all had different things that we've had that happen to us with over the course of things. We've had these things that have taken our attention. And I used to show sometimes a picture of how, kids are so distracted on these phones all day, every day, right? Well, there's a famous photo of a train in I think it's 28. And every man on the train is not talking to one another. Nobody's speaking. They're all reading a newspaper. And I just think that that's so funny. And so we need to obviously kind of realize where we've come from, that there's the only real change that we've had with our distractions and our temptations is that now we have the access because we have it in our pockets. And so a good way to think about that and teaching our kids about that is to, again, limit that, put those boundaries up, explain to your kids and have those expectations. Tell your kids, I expect you to not do whatever it is that you have been doing. I expect you to follow our rules that we have set. I expect you to respect the boundaries that we have put up. Just like we would put any other boundaries on where you can go physically or who you can hang out with or whose house you can go to. Some of the examples that I give sometimes is, sometimes it's if you wouldn't let your kid go over to somebody's house that you knew they kept loaded guns just laying around, right? You would never do that. So infinitely more important almost is what they would see on a device like this. And so we need to make sure that we're understanding, we're protecting our kids in that way. And it's going to be a struggle because these things are not easy to do. This is one of those very difficult questions to answer because it's one of those constant struggles. You got to make sure that the expectations are set. And I'd say for parents, one of the number one things that we need to do is be consistent. Because I see parents with that all the time is that they're really, really good for a while and then they kind of slack off. I do the same thing. I don't know about you, but I'm not perfect and I do the same thing. And so again, when we think about those issues, being consistent, both with our enforcement, with our encouragement, and with sometimes with our punishment when it's necessary. We need to be consistent with those things.
And to, the consistency factor, parents, some things to keep in mind is make sure that you're talking with one another.
Communication,
about it,
absolutely.
okay? We've all heard the stories and we've all had if you have kids, you had the experience where one kid goes and asks mom, can I do this? No, dad, and dad says, okay, yeah, sure. And well, they haven't talked with one another properly. And grandparents, I'll give you this, if you've got the kids, make sure you know what mom and dad expect. We have that, we have lots of fun with the bit that what happens at grandma's house stays at grandma's house, right? But, for all of our parenting years thus far, when our kids would go to grandma's for a week or whatever, we would have to talk about the detox period because, kids tend to get away with things that they don't get to do at home. And so, but there's value. There's value in grandparents also, in parents talking with the grandparents about what you're doing. I think there's a lot of help on that front. If I could give a thought on this as well, parents, I think there's a lot to be said for finding the balance between being heavy-handed on this versus being so lax that there's no force behind what you say. There's a way to go about this with our kids in which we come across as the tyrant who is unfairly making rules just because I can. And we want to be careful about that. You utilize opportunities. I can give you an example of what happened in our household, and then we'll move on to another question. But, it's Disney Plus right now has been putting out a lot of content that parents are having to be a lot more careful about, right? Mm-hmm. And what was interesting is that June became a really crazy month because it's National LGBTQ month. And so, but one of the things that happened that we were able to take advantage of is we were able to pull up Disney Plus and say, okay, you see that whole section right here of these films. It's just right there in the middle of all the kids' stuff. But now they've all been put in a single place. And we sat down with kids and said, okay, look, these are the things you need to stay away from. I can't block them, at least I haven't figured out yet how to block that off of Disney Plus. But utilize the teachable moments when you can sit down and say, here's why we need to stay away from this. Okay, if you're going to choose to have it in your house, take those times to have those teachable moments. So just maybe some thoughts, and teaching, you mentioned earlier the ratings. What does this rating mean? If a kid is asking for an app, sit down and explain why you're not going to let them have this app. Do you see this rating on it? Do you see these screenshots? This has some things in it that we do not want in our household, those kinds of things. I think that's helpful. So going to the idea, what would you describe, or what is your approach to establishing the boundaries? Okay, let me reread the question. What was your approach to establishing boundaries when your kids are out and possibly using friends' devices that do not have the same restrictions that they follow at home?
That's a tough one too. Boy, that's one of those kinds of things that you would have to say. So okay, let me get this straight. The kid is wanting to either hang out or go to a person's house, or what?
Either way. So they leave. They have certain restrictions at home, and they know that they can't. But they go to a friend's house who does not have those restrictions, or they're hanging out at the park or at school or at the mall or wherever, and they get their friend's device.
Yeah.
How do you help train or monitor, or how do you establish those boundaries so that try to help keep that at bay?
Well, that's almost one of those things that you have to do the due diligence as a parent to ask the awkward question of the parent you're letting the child go to their home is like, hey, do you have any filters on your Wi-Fi at home? Do you have any parental controls set on these things? Because I don't want my kid seeing anything that he's not supposed to necessarily. That's a hard conversation to have. That's a hard question to ask when you're dropping off a kid. I understand that. But again, that's kind of doing that due diligence. And honestly, looking at and making sure that you tell your child, hey, you don't use anybody else's device. And you don't use any, but again, then what do you do when it's on the TV and there's something that is inappropriate to watch on the TV? It's like, well, that's a really, really difficult thing to answer. And so you just have to understand and have those moments where you watch something inappropriate over at their house. You're not going to be really allowed to go over at their house anymore until I get some reaffirmation or something that they are not going to be able to allow you to watch those things. And that's a huge, huge issue. What I've found actually, Corey, is that is a huge issue with divorced parents who live separately, obviously. The dad or the mom, one of the ones may not be enforcing where one is enforcing. Mm-hmm. And they're required to go see them on certain weekends or things like that.
Right.
That is a huge thing that I've seen as well. And so, boy, that you talk about complex and awkward to ask and discuss with those different things. That's another one of those things where if you do have that situation in your life, make sure that at least you have those same protections in place on the device. You can set things on the device, but you can also set it for home networks at both places as well. And so again, that's just something you'll have to work out in those situations.
So I've got 3 more questions, okay, and then we'll wrap this up. Can you give some thoughts or suggestions as parents and grandparents are going to establish these boundaries? You mentioned the family you met, Carolina or wherever it was, that they had the triplet daughters that have never had a device in their whole life, and they're getting ready to go to college, and at a public state university.
Right.
What do you have some thoughts on how to find the balance so that you are allowing your kids to be well exposed to this and to be functional within the world as it is,
right,
but without being overcome by it?
So, I use the illustration sometimes that you wouldn't throw your child who can't swim into the deep end of Olympic-sized swimming pool and just hope that they'd be okay. That's not what you're going to do. What we want our kids to be able to do is kind of wade ankle deep in the stream, and then knee deep, and then get in the kiddie pool, and then then this. We want it to be a gradual kind of thing. It's almost a giving them more rope, giving them more freedom as they go on. And that's this thing that we do in their real physical lives. We will let them go out on a Saturday night to certain things when they're 16 or 17, whereas we wouldn't do that when they're 13 or 14. And so it's the same kind of idea when it comes to digital parenting. I said it this morning, I think I said it maybe this afternoon, have that plan between you and your spouse for each child. My son, on the autism spectrum, we have a meeting twice a year. He has something called an IEP. It's an individualized education plan. And I almost want to, I wish I had my own kind of worksheet or something. That's a good idea probably I should have, is a worksheet for having an individualized digital parenting plan for each one of your children. And just have that in, and again, it doesn't need to be something that you put on the fridge. It's not public info or anything like that. It's just something that you need to have you need to know what that strategy is for that child, because you as the parent, you know your child better than anybody else. You know their maturity level. You know that a child, if they're 17 or 18, but they're not showing the maturity that they really should be showing, you know that it's going to be a little bit of a hassle and a little bit of a conflict there, because they're thinking, oh, I'm 18, I'm an adult now. But it's going to be one of those things where we're still having to enforce those things as well. And so you can get in that situation. So understanding, of course, that each child is different, having that strategy of digital parenting from all the way from, and when do you start that? Well, you start that now. If you have kids now, if you have grandkids now, you start that today. It doesn't matter if they're 17. It doesn't matter if they're 7 or 7 months old. My wife and I have kind of those strategies in place, because if you've had 3 kids, they have 3 distinct personalities and different ways of looking at those different ideas and different ways that they're going to try to test you as the parent. And so that's one of those things that we've had to do as well. I know that's a long answer, but that's really just develop a strategy and have it for each individual child.
So 2 things you mentioned that really springboard for these last 2 questions. You talk about the idea of, giving a little bit more rope along the way. What about, let's give this one out for our teens. How can a teenager build the trust with the parents so that they are able to gain more of that access over time that as they seek for more of that independence?
I got to sit down with a group of teens in North Carolina in January of 21. They were ready to come at me with everything, because I had badmouthed Snapchat the night before so bad to the parents. They heard all of it, and they were ready to come. They were on fire, ready to tell me everything they want. Snapchat is used positively for this, and this, and they had drafted a whole document, everything like this.
Said they had drafted that document in Snapchat, right?
In Snapchat, and they had collaborated on Snapchat with that. And so we use this for a good purpose and kind of things like that. And so the main thing I heard from that discussion, though, I scrapped my talk for that night, and I sat down with them, and I said, this was 8 months after the pandemic started. These kids had not gone back to school yet. They had been in lockdown for several months. They'd barely been out doing things. Snapchat had been their lifeline. And this guy from Tennessee came in the night before and completely annihilated it, right? So they were gonna take me to task on it. And I scrapped my talk, and I asked them, I said, what have you guys been dealing with? Just sit down, talk with me, tell me, what have you guys been dealing with just the last year? And it was one of the most powerful discussions I've ever had. One of the number one things they said was, my parents act like, and again, this could be a bunch of different situations, a bunch of different things, take it with a grain of salt. But my parents don't trust me. I feel like they're looking for something to nail me on all the time. They're waiting to catch me red-handed on stuff. I just feel like they're constantly looking over my shoulder. And I flat out asked one of the kids, I said, well, have you given them a reason to do that? If your kids give you the reasons to do that, to distrust, then parents are going to have that attitude. But in most cases here, that wasn't actually the case. And so I think what kids want is to be more of a, especially when you get old, when you get kids older. I'm talking about 15 to 18-year-olds here. When you get a little bit older of a child and you can reason with them almost like you would an adult and talk with them about those things, it needs to be almost more of a team effort at that point. Because you're getting to the point where, and David Shannon said this phrase in a talk several years ago. He said, you're parenting with the end in mind. And the end comes when your daily influence as a parent is largely over. I'm almost 41 years old. My mom said, text me when your plane lands, and I'm so worried about you and stuff like that. That's what she said. And so we're still parents. We're still going to worry about our kids. But when our kids go off on their own, when they go to college, that's the end of that daily relationship for the most part. That's what we're preparing them for. And so when we get to that stage of 15, 16, 17, 18 years old, it almost needs to be that more of a team approach of, you're showing me ways that I can trust you, and I'm giving you a little bit more freedom. And kids want, of course, they want that freedom. And it's sometimes you're going to give them a little bit of rope, and you may take a lot back. And you may give them a little bit and take a ton back. But at the same time, it's one of those give and take kind of attitudes for that.
Yeah, so I'm hearing two things out of that. One, in that answer, one to the teens and one to the parents.
Yes.
Teens, if you want your parents to trust you more, you've got to be trustworthy. They have set rules in place. If you spend all of your time bucking against the rules and you keep arguing nonstop and you keep breaking them all the time, that's not the way to establish trust. Doesn't mean you have to like the rules. It doesn't mean that the rules are always going to stay that way, but you have to act trustworthy in order to gain trust. But parents on the other side of that, let's make sure we have reasons for our rules. Let's make sure that the parameters we put in place are reasonable and that we are trying to move down a path that would allow them to earn that trust so that they can be those adults, so they can be ready to launch, as when that time comes. Last question, and we're going to wrap this up. You also mentioned back a bit ago, maybe sometimes you have, you as a parent know the maturity level of your kid. And you may run across those times where you have those older teens, let's say, 17, 18, 19, who are not at the maturity level. So, when this question came in, how can we convey parameters for an older teen, 17, 18, 19, who is definitely not ready for the world, but is pushing back against the house technology rules and our authority to set those parameters?
Well, I think that's a tough situation, first of all, that an 18, 19, 20-year-old might not be able to do that. But at the same time, it's one of those types of things, and you hate to say this, you hate to put that hammer down, but it's like, are you still living under our roof? If you're still living under our roof and under our rules, that's the agreement that we've had for all these years before, and it's still the case. Not you being 18 or 19 doesn't change those things. And another thing with that is are we paying for your phone? Is this phone provided by us? I tell parents of younger kids, I say, you need to look at it sometimes as this is my phone and I'm allowing you to use it. And so this is one of those cases where we need to make sure that you are in line with the things that we need to do, because you're going to need a little bit of extra time to develop in those certain situations. And that's tough, especially when you have a situation like that. But you might offer some other suggestions as well.
The only thought that comes to my mind with it is similar to what you've said, or springboarding. If you're if you're talking to that teenager who is 17, 18, 19, legally they are approaching adulthood. Okay, well then let's talk about this as adults. If you were to be out on your own, if you were to go sign a lease agreement at an apartment, there would be rules of what you can and can't do. And if you don't follow them, they're going to evict you. If you're paying for these things, then maybe there's the conversation to be had, okay, let's talk about being an adult. Right now, your situation is that this is something that is being provided for you, and so therefore there are strings attached. there are stipulations for it. And so then maybe that's an angle that could possibly be taken for that conversation.
And I think that's also a motivator for them to do what is right.
Yeah.
To make sure that they can grow effectively and kind of move forward with that.
Yeah. Well, Chad, thank you for the whole day, for the lessons and the insight and advice. As you said before, these slides and these kinds of things, we will be able to make those available. We'll figure out the best way to do that. Before we wrap up, Chad, I'm going to give you last opportunity. Anything you want to say just to kind of wrap up the day?
Thank y'all so much. Really appreciate it. Has some of this stuff been helpful today? Okay. Well, if we help one person with one idea, that's my whole mission, is to help one parent with one idea, to help them be a better digital parent. Not just that, but to help their kids be holy and righteous and do what is right in the sight of God, and bring them up in that nurture and admonition of the Lord. So again, thank y'all so much for having me.
Excellent. Mike, do you mind coming up and closing us out in a word of prayer?